Hello and welcome to this webinar on the 7 key trends in enterprise risk management. Kevin Legere, and presenting with me today is John Verver.
Hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. Just a little bit of background about myself. I've had several decades of experience now specializing in the application of technology and particularly data analytics in risk management and compliance and audit. I started with Deloitte in the UK, moved to Canada, and I was a principal with Deloitte and Touche at the time when I left. I joined ACL in its very early days, more than 25 years ago. I led the professional services area there, and for a number of years led the product management and product strategy area.
Thanks, John. My name is Kevin Legere. I'm currently the Director of Product Design here at ACL. I manage and oversee the execution of our product strategy and our product roadmap here at ACL. Previously, I worked on our services consulting team here at ACL, implementing our technology into customer organizations. And before that, I sort of have a long history in data analysis, primarily working on in the healthcare industry. So let's get started. First, I'm going to go through the agenda. In the minute webinar today, we'll take you through excellence in ERM and corporate performance, 7 key trends in ERM. Then we'll talk about the 6 major components of a high-performance data-driven ERM process. Finally, we'll talk about the 15 functional capabilities of ERM software that are critical for success. Between 5 and 10 minutes to answer any questions that may come from the audience. Management is a broadly used term that can encompass and mean many things. John, can you define enterprise risk management for us to set some context for what we'll be talking about today?
Certainly, Kevin. And as many of you may well know already, there are various formal definitions that different organizations have produced around what is enterprise risk management. And most definitions out there, I think, overlap to a fair extent, as you'd expect. But I find this one, coming from RIMS, the Risk Management Society, probably one of the most comprehensive, and really is the definition I think I like most. And in terms of definition, what is it? Well, I think ERM is addressing the full range of an organization's risks and managing them as an interrelated portfolio. And in the context of what is going on both inside and outside of the organization, as well as in the context of the organization's overall objectives, strategic and corporate objectives. And I think the key to this is really that it represents a big shift from organizations that have traditionally looked at risk and compliance in a series of silos. And they tend to struggle to arrive at an integrated view of all types of risks across the organization. And this definition from RIMS also refers to what I think are 2 other important aspects of enterprise risk management, that ultimately the objective is to improve corporate performance and do things like provide competitive advantage and also embed analytics in many aspects of decision making across the organization.
Great. So a well-established ERM program can be crucial to helping an organization achieve their strategic objectives. John, in your view, how can organizations implement an ERM program that drives, as you just talked about, that corporate performance?
Yeah, and that, of course, is a great question. How do you do it? Since just talking about taking an enterprise-wide approach to risk management certainly doesn't mean that it's a simple thing to do. In practice, for most organizations, it's an evolving process. It does take some time and effort and resources to achieve. So most organizations take a phased approach that involves different stages, and we'll take a look at those shortly. But some of the most important aspects of ERM and how it really impacts organizational performance, I think you can see referred to on this slide. So For example, using data to assess and monitor risk is critical to move risk management from a subjective, a typically rear-looking retrospective process to one that is moving, it's dynamic, it's quantified in terms of quantification of risk, it's ongoing, and it's predictive of what is likely to happen. The trends, it's a way of identifying the trends that are likely to cause problems within an organization. And enterprise risk management needs to take a comprehensive view of multiple types of risks and their impact on each other and in aggregate. Again, something that's very, very difficult to achieve, if not impossible, within a very siloed approach. And to do all of this means taking a collaborative approach in the multiple risk and compliance and business functions, as well as audit, so all three lines of defense. They work together in order to better understand and manage and actually respond to risks in a way that helps the organization to perform better. And if this process is performed in a truly collaborative and integrated and intelligent way, then it can have a big impact. And it's not just about efficiency. That is a big part of it. It's not just more efficient processes and having a series of separate silos, but it causes people to think and act about what's really important to running a better business. And of course, to answer the how you do this part of the question, we could spend a lot of time on that. There's another critical element, but that really involves the planning, the strategy, defining the goals, setting the plan, and then managing the implementation process as you move to ERM as an ongoing project.
Thanks, John. That's obviously a lot to consume. So let's take a look maybe at what the journey could look like in that phased approach to get there. Many organizations want to implement integrated risk management right from day one. In our experience, that's just not cool. Building an ERM program takes time, and it's best done in phases that build and iterate on each other over time. John, can you maybe describe in your experience how you've seen organizations build out their ERM capabilities and evolve their ERM programs over time?
Sure, and this is a very practical issue, Kevin, as I've been alluding to, really, moving from a silo approach to an efficient and a well-integrated enterprise approach takes time and resources. And so like many things, it can be considered to be a journey, but there are certainly specific phases that most organizations go through. And you can see the slide here, you're identifying major phases, 5 major phases of maturity, if you like. But things don't necessarily need to be done in this sequence, but here are the main phases that we tend to see take place. And the first, of course, is moving away from silos and starting to centralize the process of identifying and assessing and managing different risks and compliance issues. And then the next phase is often to begin to use data analytics to support the process in terms of things like determining if processes and controls are effective and using analytics to monitor and identify risk trends, as well as to assess and quantify different types of risks. And then all of this results in all 3 lines of defense being able to look at risks in comparable ways and respond accordingly. And once all of these first 3 processes and phases are in place and working well, that's quite a lot of progress in itself. But once all of those processes working efficiently, then organizations tend to really reap the benefits of that approach. It involves a cultural shift, and it involves often increasingly focusing on managing risks in better ways and tying decisions far more directly to impact on strategic objectives and corporate performance and profitability. And this normally involves an organization, certainly at the higher levels of maturity, really beginning to also treat risks, at least some types of risks, as opportunities to be cleverly managed, smartly managed, and not just things to be avoided in the more traditional approach. So I'm talking about things in terms of opportunities, things that could give competitive advantage or new business opportunities, or even just a process that could be a lot more effective and efficient. as long as you manage some of the potential drawbacks. And so it's really, all of this is increasingly focused on how risks impact performance, how you can improve performance, and how risk management becomes a core part, ultimately, of decision-making across the organization.
Great. I think that really helps set the context for everything we're going to talk about today. Now we're going to dive into some of the details a little bit more and talk about the 7 key trends that are emerging in enterprise risk management. The first key trend is organizations are, as John alluded to earlier, trying to break down those silos across teams and trying to view risk more holistically. John, can you talk about some key challenges you've seen organizations being faced with, and also what are some things they can do to avoid common pitfalls?
Yeah, this is probably the primary reason that the whole concept of enterprise risk management came about in the first place. That is, for many organizations, and particularly those with, say, multiple entities in multiple regions or locations, there's probably a broad range of risk and compliance issues that impact different industries and different business processes in different locations in different ways. And so it's not surprising that given that silos arose in the first place, meaning teams that tended to focus exclusively on addressing a specific set of risks or compliance issues. But that, of course, led to some obvious challenges. And one is that it's very difficult to take risk assessments from each silo and combine them in a meaningful way in order to present an overall current state of the view of a risk that an organization is managing to say, executive management or the board. And often any attempt when you have a very siloed approach is that you end up with a mix of apples and oranges, different types of risks that are really pretty hard to assess and respond to in a consistent way and in a way that makes sense to prioritize your efforts. And it's also difficult, if not impossible, to see how risks from different areas may in fact impact and relate to each other. And another issue arising from silos is often that each silo has its own systems and processes that typically evolved over time, whether they be using spreadsheets or some specialized compliance software, risk management software, or some homegrown system. But what happens is you end up with duplicative and inefficient and incompatible processes that ultimately are expensive and inefficient to maintain. Yet on the other hand, organizations that take an integrated approach to ERM, they really work to ensure that there are consistent processes as far as is reasonable and comparable ways of assessing and quantifying different types of risks. And so this means that it's possible to efficiently produce a meaningful combined and aggregated report on risks across the enterprise. And this also starts to enable organizations to see things like risk trends overall that may impact, let's say, a particular region or a combination of areas that would have been very challenging to see when there are disconnected risk and compliance functions. And it also becomes a lot more feasible to see how, for example, let's say, compliance risks arising from, say, FCPA failures or environmental product problems ultimately impact profitability and corporate objectives and things like revenue.
So the second key trend that we're seeing is developing a consistent approach to quantifying risk. Without having a consistent approach across the lines of defense, you'll never be able to agree on what's actually important to the organization. John, can you talk about the traditional approaches and how organizations are using analytics to overcome this?
Yeah, and I think this is a relatively simple issue in that, I referred to the apples and oranges issues in comparing risks. And what it often comes down to is assessing the impact of different types of risks in quantifiable and comparable and objective terms. And this is important because under a silo approach, a traditional approach, it's often the case that there are multiple ways of determining how big a risk is and the size of the impact. So the challenge is, how do senior or executive management know how to focus? How should they prioritize responses if they're getting assessments that really don't validly compare to each other. So the big trend in ERM is to both implement a consistent way of assessing and measuring risk, as well as to move to more objective quantification of the risks. And that, of course, is where data and various forms of information, internal information, external information, they play a key role in this. So to effectively allow the risk management function to say, based on examination of what's occurred and the likelihood of things occurring, we see that here is a risk that if we don't act, there is a 50% chance of, say, a $100 million negative event impacting our business. Something that would have been far harder to do in a credible way, a reliable way, under a traditional approach.
Yeah, when you can really quantify that risk to the organization, it's much easier to prioritize things and show just how important some of them could be. The third trend we're going to talk about is, again, building on the idea of using analytics, is utilizing data and modern analysis techniques to gain valuable insights. John, how are organizations utilizing data today to better manage, monitor, or even predict risk?
Yeah, and I think really this is just expanding upon the last trend around objective quantification and risk, and the trend is really around using analytics, big data analytics, to monitor risks in a way that's just not just quantifiable, but increasingly predictive of new and emerging risks. And this is critical because, as I said earlier, just looking retrospectively at things that have happened really doesn't do very much to help manage risk in the most effective way. And the important thing is clearly to have up-to-date insight into what is currently happening. For example, an important control or process that's clearly broken, as well as what's likely to happen, what is beginning to occur, maybe not on a scale that's going to cause significant damage yet, but what may seem to be a relatively small compliance issue or an external issue such as a new competitor or major foreign exchange currency fluctuations, that can quickly escalate into something that causes real damage. So having a fact-based, a data-driven insight into what's actually happening and what's likely to happen given current trends is really critical here. And this is where the power of data is so important. And I think if you look at how big data and analytics have transformed many aspects of business processes, just look at the impact of big data on sales and marketing in many organizations. So I think you say, well, it makes a lot of sense to apply big data concepts to monitoring risks across the enterprise by, for example, continually monitoring the millions of transactions and activities that take place across all the business processes within an enterprise.
Yeah, more and more we're seeing people use data in order to see what the current state of risk is, so that they can react to change faster. But also, as you said, using data to see what could happen in the future. The fourth trend is organizations are looking for a more cost-effective approach to internal controls. We know that analytics can play a huge role in taking away some of that burden. John, you have a long history in this area. Can you explain the challenges organizations are faced with and how they can use analytics to overcome them?
Sure, and I find this a very interesting area. I've written a lot about it. I've spoken a lot about it over the years. And I think it boils down to, in some ways, internal controls often have a bit of a bad reputation among, say, business managers, operational managers, where they tend to see some controls anyway, as impediments to getting the job done and meeting their performance objectives. And to some extent, these views can be justified, especially when controls become very expensive to maintain and they start to negatively impact productivity in cases where the risk of bad stuff happening is actually pretty low. And yet, on the other hand, of course, allowing a culture in which controls are routinely bypassed or ignored is obviously unhealthy and can cause major problems. And the answer is, for at least some types of risks, to rely on analytics to monitor activities continuously, to monitor transactions, financial and operational transactions, And so, instances of regulatory non-compliance or fraud or waste and abuse can be monitored and identified so that appropriate responses can be made. And instead of preventing every single possible risky transaction from ever occurring with comprehensive and endless controls, the objective with this approach is to get a balance and to zero in on the bad stuff that's actually happening. And if the risk exposure or the financial impact is relatively low, it may be sufficient to simply monitor for instances that clearly violate controls or risk thresholds. And if the risk or the impact is high, then transactions can immediately red flag to inform which specific controls can be implemented, which are the really important controls to prevent critical issues arising in the future. And one other thing about using analytics in this way, I think, is there's actually often a deterrent effect from supplementing control processes with analytic and transaction monitoring. Often if individual employees know that a policy is in place, maybe the controls aren't that actually strict in the way they're implemented, but they know that adherence is expected and that adherence is actually being monitored. Then the more traditional and the more expensive and laborious control approaches become necessary. And data analysis and transaction monitoring allows that sort of fine-tuning, if you like, to build a system that's neither under-controlled nor over-controlled. I think that's essentially it. Other than transaction monitoring, there's other things, of course, which is to identify risks for which no control exists in the first place, some sort of new business activity or situation.
The fifth trend we're seeing is making informed decisions while balancing risk, but also the flip side to risk opportunity. John, how can organizations assure that they're taking the right risks at the right time and maximizing their ability to take advantage of opportunities?
Yeah, I think this is a really important trend in that it shifts some fundamental thinking about risk that some organizations have had for years. A traditional approach emphasized risk avoidance with multiple processes and controls designed to reduce risks of error and fraud and compliance failures. And what is missing in all of this is the realization that taking risks in terms of new opportunities, managing them in a smart way, doing things in a different way, is key to business success. Of course, many business leaders know this already. They take risks and opportunities into account whenever deciding on a course of action around achieving objectives. But without a formalized process and without things such as data analytics and fact-based assessments and trends, even an experienced business leader is not always going to respond to risks in the smartest way. And for many others in the organization, particularly those, say, in the second or third line of defense, this may even be a bit of a foreign concept. Many auditors and compliance specialists traditionally are taught to look for all the things that could go wrong without necessarily putting it into the context sufficiently of what's really important to the business. So this trend is really all about taking a smart, intelligent, well-managed approach to running a business at all levels and across multiple roles based on that knowledge of what's happening and achieving an informed response to risks.
The sixth trend we're going to talk about is organizations are integrating risk management into their daily business activities. More and more, we're seeing organizations developing a culture around risk management across all of their lines of defense. John, can you talk about how this is changing, how organizations are run, and what are some of the benefits you are seeing from this approach?
Yeah, I think this trend, it is a distinct trend of integration into daily business activities, but it does build upon all the things that we just discussed in the first 5 trends. And it's all about driving an intelligent approach to risk management into day-to-day decision-making throughout the organization. As more and more team members in different areas become aware of the overall benefits of seeing opportunity and risk as 2 sides of the same coin, they begin to better understand the impact of their decisions on the achievement of corporate objectives and put in the context of what this means for corporate objectives and strategic objectives. And it also means that managers, they seek to be continually informed about the risks and the opportunities within their area of responsibility, and they take a more proactive approach to managing both. And I think a culture that really begins to address risk and opportunity in this way results in employees that feel more empowered to take on informed risks rather than focusing on an expectation that their performance is measured on how much risk they eliminated and how much they kind of cover themselves to avoid, to avoid getting into trouble. And technology can particularly help in this area where techniques such as scenario analysis and use of risk visualization dashboards become a standard part of management practices.
The seventh trend follows on the last one a little bit and is about bridging the gap between the business and risk professionals. John, what can organizations do to help bridge this gap, and how will this improve their performance?
Yeah, no, I think this is another very important trend. It's sort of part of a cultural shift and certainly a common challenge to successful ERM implementation in many organizations has traditionally been the divide between the risk management professionals and maybe business management and maybe audit as well. And you know, in some cases, risk professionals, they may lack the business context to fully understand risks. Business managers may lack some of the practical understanding of specific types of risks and the role of risk and compliance control frameworks, say. So the solution is really around achieving an integrated approach in which risk management frameworks and regulatory requirements and controls and compliance processes are rolling together in ways that allow both business managers and risk management professionals and the executive suite, the C-suite, to see the world through a similar lens and context. And integrating these shareholders as part of a single program or on a single shared platform, it transforms that traditional disjointed and siloed approach into one that allows for far more, if you look, unified oversight of risk. And it gets the entire organization working together in the same direction, ideally anyway, achieving objectives and driving performance, or better understanding the perspectives and concerns of management in other functions and roles.
Great. So let's move on. And in light of the trends we are seeing, let's examine the 6 key characteristics of a smart performance-enhancing ERM program. The first characteristic of a good ERM program is meaningful centralized risk identification. What are some common problems organizations run into with risk identification, and how will they improve if they can follow a centralized approach?
This really flows directly from that basic need in ERM to achieve a consistent and comprehensive view of risks across the organization. You just can't do that effectively without some form of centralized repository that allows people to clearly categorize all risks and different types of risks by type, such as strategic level risk or process level risk, compliance risk, and show how they relate to each other and as I was saying, how they impact corporate objectives. But this really provides all 3 lines of defense with that centralized system which to perform their roles and collaborate. And it forms a basis for that combined and aggregated view of risks that really help the organization to manage risk more intelligently.
The second characteristic is to ensure that strategic risks are linked to objectives, processes, and policies. John, how will this ensure that proper risk quantum mitigations are in place for an organization?
Well, I think instead of different teams focusing on the limited number of risks and what needs to be done to mitigate or manage just those risks, one of the things that having a central repository of risks can do, and having the risks linked to all relevant controls and processes, allows for a far more comprehensive understanding of how risks are being managed. And it allows, just for example, for linking relevant certain controls and processes to each other in ways that maybe have never been thought of or never done before. And it allows also for linking, to put things in the context, of course, of strategic corporate goals. But here's an example. It could mean that, say, an FCPA compliance risk, anti-bribery and corruption risk in one region can be connected to FCPA compliance risks in all regions and all operating entities, and also connected maybe to other controls that are in place around purchase and payment approvals, so that, as well as maybe vendor management controls. There's just one example where if you look more holistically at, hey, here's a risk issue relating to FCPA, we're tackling it in multiple different ways, globally in different entities. Why don't we take a more consistent approach to avoid duplication and so on? And the risk of compliance failures for FCPA can be aggregated and they can be looked at in terms of corporate objectives and impact. And it's this centralized approach of risks and then connecting to the policies and connecting to regulatory requirements and controls. It also provides a foundation of information that supports ERM throughout the entity and for all three lines of defense.
The third characteristic is to use data analytics and continuous monitoring to help inform the risk assessment. John, can you talk about how analytics play a key role in assessing and monitoring risk and why this is critical to a successful risk management program?
Sure, and some of this we've spoken about already, but I'll expand upon that though. Risks are assessed and ranked on an ongoing basis through multiple means, including determining the impact of control weaknesses and failures identified through monitoring data and testing transactions that flow through all the key operational financial processes. Analytics can also play a key role throughout the risk assessment process, from examining data to determining the existence of risks the organization may not even be aware of, to assessing and quantifying both inherent and residual risks. And analysis of data from both within and outside the organization plays a key role in that continuous risk assessment. And another, apart from that sort of transactional financial activity analysis, another aspect of continuous monitoring and use of data is things like use of automated questionnaires and automated surveys that provide important additional data-driven input into risk assessment, and they will provide up-to-date confirmation of the effectiveness of policies and control procedures or weaknesses. Another thing related to data is employee hotlines. Yet another means of obtaining important data on actual and potential risks. And it's this data-driven approach, thinking more broadly about all the different types of data that could be employed, that helps to inject far more fact-based, if you like, a far more scientific approach to ERM processes, which is often missing when assessments and decision-making are based on the purely subjective views of those involved in risk management.
The fourth characteristic is developing a consistent enterprise-wide approach to risk management. John, how will this help organizations scale their risk management program throughout the organization?
And yeah, this is a tricky area in practice. In order to effectively scale an ERM program, it's very important to be able to compare and aggregate different types of risks. But forcing every team involved in risk and compliance management to follow an identical approach, that can clearly result in attempts to fit square pegs into round holes and try and mix apples and oranges. But the key is to recognize what does need to be standardized and consistent in order to be able to generate that consolidated, integrated view of risks, while also supporting risk management and compliance activities that vary widely from, say, operational manufacturing processes to financial processes and so on. And a standardized approach is achievable at some level, though, even though the specifics of risks and control measures are widely divergent. The key is really often to assess risk in terms of impact on a series of key objectives, as well as to quantify risks in terms of probabilities and size of impact. The objective is to get a balance around all of this, and this is ultimately what allows for comparison and aggregation of different risks.
The fifth characteristic we're going to talk about is dealing with the things that really matter. It sounds obvious, but so often organizations can get caught up in resolving tactical issues that have very, very little impact. John, how can organizations ensure that they're putting their resources in the most effective areas?
Yeah, and I think one of the most important benefits of a technology-enabled, data-driven approach is the ability to get insights into what's likely to happen and be able to do something about it on a timely basis. And this is where continuous monitoring and analytics, they produce trend reports that are critical to identifying areas of concern from a risk perspective, as well as areas of opportunity. And this makes it possible to respond quickly and really focus resources at where the problems lie. And then rather than only responding after it's apparent as a big problem, it means that teams can be preemptive and fix problems before they escalate. And this enables the ability as well to spot a business opportunity or business improvement opportunity that wouldn't otherwise have been apparent. And of course, trends relating to risk can be shown in multiple dimensions, like time and business area and geography and risk and control type. And the value of trend reporting and rapid response is certainly vastly preferable to that retroactive traditional way of assessing risk.
The sixth characteristic is reporting the right way to the right people. John, can you explain how effective reporting can help in the overall effectiveness of a risk management program?
Yeah, and this is certainly another critical aspect. You need to know the big picture of risk management status, but also the detail that can vary tremendously in different areas. And among the weaknesses in traditional approaches are those limitations around reporting. You know, executive managers may not care about the detail of stuff, and control process owners may not care or perhaps not have access to all of the strategic corporate risks. But what everyone should have are meaningful reports to their own individual areas of responsibility, and of course put in the context of achievement of overall objectives. And that's where real-time current reporting dashboards become very relevant, very important, as long as they're relevant to the individual recipient.
I think that this provides, now that we've gone through the characteristics and the key trends going on in ERM, I think that this provides a good overview of the important components of an ERM process in practice. John, can you take us through how all of this fits together?
Sure, and I'll do this very quickly just for the sake of time here. You know, I won't go into the details, but of course, if you see here, the first aspect is where you're looking at the process flow, creating a central risk repository, assessing risks, linking them to as necessary, and deciding how to address the risks through control and other processes. Then in the next slide, we see that the critical stage is to continually monitor whether controls or processes are working as intended, and that involves examining transactions, as we know, from multiple sources. Then in the next stage, you respond to the results of monitoring, you address issues that arise or are expected to arise. Then the results of all of this need to be available as dashboards and reports. And then finally, it's an ongoing process of improvements and enhancements to the entire ERM system. And probably the most important thing to get from this graphic, apart from those key stages, is that, you know, we're showing the entire process as a loop, because it is an ongoing, it's a reiterative one that needs to be dynamic and constantly updated and constantly improved in order to make sure that it's effective and timely.
Great. So let's now take a look at some of the specific functional capabilities that are needed to support the ERM processes that we've been describing. So first up, and this builds a lot on what John was talking about, having a centrally maintained risk repository that all stakeholders can access with real-time updated information is critical. Everyone needs to be making decisions off the same source of information. As things change, and we always know they will, you can ensure that there's one source of truth. This is a common pitfall of maintaining this information in spreadsheets and share drives. Different versions of information can get passed around and emailed, and it can quickly become unmanageable. Using technology can ensure that all stakeholders are looking at the most current state of risk and everyone is on the same page. Next up, enterprise risk management should always start by looking at an organization's strategic objectives. From there, you can work on identifying the risks the organization faces on achieving them. Looking at the risks through the lens of your strategic objectives allows you to see accumulation and interaction of risk as it relates to the key things your organization is striving to achieve. This allows you to see where are weak spots, and then that way you can point resources at the right initiatives and programs to ensure that it's properly mitigated. Technology is key in helping you create and maintain these different relationships. And then as you can see in this particular heat map, you can see how risk can accumulate and interact across different strategic objectives and operating entities. This is extremely important as well to be able to map your risk to policies, processes, and control objectives. From there, you should be able to quantify not only how big is this risk to our organization, but be able to quantify how much treatment or how much mitigation and controls do we have in place in order to mitigate this risk. This really helps an organization prioritize their resources by focusing on areas with highest risk or potentially areas that have the least amount of coverage. Technology can offer a fully integrated solution so that information from your audit, risk, and compliance teams can aggregate up to a single view. That way, your organization can assess sort of overall assurance around risk mitigation efforts and have a bird's eye view of risks across the entire organization. COSO and ISO are really good risk management frameworks that you can use as a basis for your risk management program. But sometimes they can get a little bit too theoretical, and it can be really hard to apply them to your day-to-day job. This is where I think technology can sort of come in and help you apply those frameworks in a practical way. And technology, a lot of technology, especially ERM technology, is built on the basis of these risk management frameworks. And then they apply them in a practical way throughout the product. So it's seamless for you, the end consumer, to integrate them into your risk management processes. This can really help organizations sort of catapult themselves to building a scalable risk management program without having to do months or years of research and implementing. Another critical capability is around being able to connect data from a wide range of sources. Being able to access data from various places in order to measure, monitor, and predict risk is really, really important. Without data, as John kind of alluded to earlier, risk assessments can be highly subjective and often biased by opinions of individuals. Using technology, you can gather data from sources from all over your organization, whether they're disparate or integrated, and use them to inform your risk assessment. This really helps organizations make the right decisions and ultimately maximize their corporate performance. Not only can data inform the risk assessment, but it can monitor change of risk over time. And it's sort of really important to monitor these changes so that you can react to them as an organization as they happen and really ensure that you're doing everything you can so your organization can ultimately achieve its goals. The one thing we know about data is that it's ever increasing in volume and velocity, almost exponentially. Valuable insights and issues can sometimes be uncovered actually in individual transactions that make up these huge volumes of data. Without the use of technology, analyzing transactional data in your organization would be almost impossible. Organizations should really strive to analyze 100% of your transactional data so that you can ensure that you're tracking, monitoring, and predicting risk and really setting up your organization to put its best foot forward in achieving its corporate objectives. Building on analytics, we know that about 60% of business processes are common across different organizations, things like accounts payable, payroll, and vendor management. The other 30% tend to be sort of industry specific. Think about banking, insurance, and healthcare. And then finally, every organization sort of has its specific needs and will need some customized analytics to monitor what it thinks is important. Kind of the point I want to drive home here is that technology can be used to automate a lot of this repetitive work and provide valuable insight and analytics and data to the right people at the right time. And make sure that you're spending less time on those day-to-day manual tasks and spending more time helping your organization achieve its corporate objectives. Next up is around sort of data visualization and trend analysis. Having to manually put together and aggregate information is, as most people probably know, is really time-consuming, but it's also very prone to error. Imagine having a risk register in Excel, and you maybe build your heat maps in PowerPoint. I've seen this a lot. What typically happens is then your information tends to get out of sync. What happens when your risk assessment changes? Now you need to manually update your heat maps. It's very easy for these to get out of sync, have incorrect information, or maybe not updated information. Technology is really built to take away this burden by providing out-of-the-box data visualization tools and heat maps and making them available to all the stakeholders with the most current risk assessment or the most current data information. Monitoring risks, controls, and processes isn't very useful, though, if no one knows when something bad happens. Manually checking reports is too slow and often liable to fail. Technology can be instrumental in automating the routing of issues and exceptions and ensuring that proper escalation happens when problems are not resolved in a timely fashion. When problems are identified, being able to centrally track, manage, and remediate them is critical to ensuring that proper measures are being taken. Technology can ensure that everyone knows the status, priority, and who's responsible for a current issue or exception. It also provides a means of sort of centralizing collaboration across your various different teams and providing workflow to make sure that the proper steps are being taken and appropriate people are involved in resolving issues. A good risk management program will not only analyze transactional data, but as John talked about, also attempt to gather and analyze information from people in the organization, often the people who manage the day-to-day operations of an organization. When doing this en masse, this is best done with surveys powered by technology. Surveys offer an easy way to gather information from a lot of people in a consistent way so that you can easily identify trends, find common themes, and build reports and can be used as a good method for helping to identify risk, but also for risk assessment and monitoring purposes. Risk event forms or hotlines are also an effective way to sort of gather human data and provide insight into incidents, risk events, or even fraud or theft. Organizations can use sort of event forms or even anonymous forms for people to be able to sort of highlight when maybe some of these activities are happening. And then the important part is having workflow to ensure that follow-up is happening and ensuring that proper action is being taken when these events are being risen. Being able to assess risk on impact and likelihood and potentially a lot of other factors like velocity and vulnerability is important for organizations to prioritize their risk and their risk response efforts. Technology can really be instrumental in creating a consistent approach to risk assessment and automate the risk scoring models and heat maps for you. If you're not scoring risk across the organization with a consistent approach, then as John talked about, you'll never be able to compare and prioritize your risks across an organization. Customizable dashboards can give executives and stakeholders access to the information they deem most important to making key decisions that affect the performance of an organization. Technology can really help you provide real-time insight into this information and customize how it's presented to stakeholders. If you haven't seen it yet, I suggest you check out the recent webinar with our CEO, Lori Schultz, on how to move up the risk value chain. In this webinar, she shows how we internally at ACL use our own technology to monitor risk and performance. Lastly, no organization has one system where they manage the business. In this age of technology, organizations are using a multitude of tools to manage their organization, and a variety of technology will be used for various activities. That's why we feel it's important to embrace this age of what we call open data. What do we mean by open data? Well, really what we're saying is that it should be easy to integrate data across different systems, both from a workflow perspective, but also for data analysis and reporting. This allows your organization to use a combination of tools for managing risk, compliance, and audit programs, but also still have the ability to aggregate information into a single view. So that concludes the presentation today. We're going to open up to some questions from the audience. So just give me a second to look at some that have been assigned to us. Looks like the first one. This one is asking sort of, what's the best way to identify how mature our company's ERM capability is? This is a really great question. I think really builds on some of the things that we talked about today. John, do you want to maybe take a stab at answering this for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. I think probably one of the best ways is actually to just take that maturity chart we have in the slide deck, for example, and ask questions around the different stages that are identified there in terms of things such as, okay, how do we work right now? Are we clearly silo-based? Do we actually have any form of centralized risk repository? To what extent do we have different processes in place around risk management and compliance in different silos? Are there cases where different teams are using one system? You know, to what extent is there collaboration among three lines of defense? Are analytics being used in the ERM process? And not just looking at those 5 bars from that chart necessarily, but stepping back for a moment and saying, okay, well, how widespread is our awareness of risk management practices within the organization? What's the culture? What's the view of the executive management? Are risks formally considered and weighed during all business decision making? That's probably the best way to define your maturity. I think it'll be pretty apparent quite quickly whether you really fall into that category of, yep, we've taken a traditional approach, we're all based on silos, or to some extent, we've already started to take this move towards ERM.
Great, thanks, John. The next question we have lined up is, I'm having trouble getting different business units, especially executive management, on board to improve our ERM process. They often don't see the value in our compliance activities. What's the best way to prove the need to implement ERM technology?
Well, Kevin.
Yeah, John, do you maybe want to take another stab at answering this one? Yeah,
no, you please weigh in. But I, just for me, I like this question because it's kind of the $64,000 question. You need to be able to prove an even value in order to move ahead. And one way is to refer to, of course, just to those organizations that have actually done this. They've moved ahead, they've implemented ERM, specific technologies, and they've achieved results. So talk to those organizations and see where they're at and what value they attain. You could do very practical things as well. I think what if you did an analysis of your current processes, the resource involved, identify duplicate and inefficient processes, how long does it take to compile reports, manage spreadsheets, and maybe come at it from that angle, the cost angle. And another way, I think, is to paint the vision for executive management of what ERM could look like. And then I think painting that vision, if it's done in a certain way, may well engage executive management saying, yeah, this is where we need to go. And of course, there are also different professional organizations, RIMS and OSEG and so on, dedicated to this area, and they have some pretty useful materials that could help.
Yeah, and I think building on what you were just building and presenting vision to executives is, and we talked about this earlier, is you have to make sure that you connect your ERM to the strategy of the organization, what are the strategic objectives your organization is trying to achieve. And if you can really connect your ERM program to the strategy, it should then to get buy-in from on how ERM can really help them those corporate objectives. The next question asks, how do you overcome resistance from managers and even many risk managers who believe it's impossible to aggregate risk direct value comparison? I think this is a really great, and what I've seen in my time, I've seen different teams within an organization sort of work together on defining a sort of risk scoring approach. So what does impact mean to our organization? What does low look like? How many millions of dollars of financial impact would mean to our organization? Ensuring that all of your teams who are assessing risk are assessing it on the same criteria. And then that way, as John talked about, you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges when comparing, contrasting, and prioritizing risk. John, do you have anything to add on that one?
Well, I think you've really got it already, Kevin. The only thing I'd add is just to say that I think actually just going through this process of having business managers and risk and compliance managers start to have this conversation and ask these questions about, well, how can we possibly compare these risks? Just having that conversation is in itself very valuable because it starts to get people to think differently and from a more truly enterprise perspective.
Thanks, John. I've been informed that we've gone a little bit over time today, so that'll be the last question that we answer in the webinar. We can follow up with unanswered questions sort of offline. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John, for all your valuable insight. For more information, feel free to contact either one of us. Our emails are included in the presentation.